So I don't know if I get the 4-degree thing and the staying in a career in a large company and moving up. That was not my journey at all. So, I didn't know what I wanted to do. In high school, I was a terrible high school student. But the one thing I did do is I knew I loved technology and I knew I loved computers. So those two things were something I did, but when I started my career, it wasn't even clear if that was going to be a profession, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I've been super lucky. I started in a time when we were basically inventing the industry, is more or less the way to think about that. So I left high school, having underperformed in my high school career, took a year off like you do in Europe to go figure out what I wanted to do. Was a plumber for a bit, which was exciting. And then joined a company in the mail room. It was a telemarketing company, and my job was to bring pallets of books to the fulfilling people, and you would call up a 800 number from an advert and say, I'm interested in a new model car. We take your details, print a label off, stick the label, stuff the envelope and ship it out. And over time, I spent more time with the technology organization than I did in the mailroom. And eventually I said to my mailroom supervisor, I'm going to take a job in the IT department. And she told me, if you leave, you're not coming back. So I took the risk, and I was incredibly lucky. This is kind of my learning part of my career, which was, we were a fast growing company. It was based around computers, and computing industry was being born in that period, really. So, we would install desktop computers. We did the first networking for business. We figured out what email meant before there was really email. I mean, it was, in fact, I remember you had to request for an email address. It wasn't something you were given naturally. It was something that we allocated sparingly across the organization. But that grounding and kind of the birth of that industry meant that there was nothing for me to learn in college, because there was more learning to be done on the job than there was, in college. So, so I did that, and it was great because I rose quickly because it was a growing company and no one else knew what to do, and we did everything. I mean, I was one of the team members who stayed the entire night while we migrated disks between disks, and I used to patch the network, and I'd hack programs together because printer drivers didn't work, and everything. We did everything. It was great. But what I realized in that period was, and this is a period where the most common networking solution was NetWare, Novell NetWare for businesses. Microsoft was starting to grow into that area, and it became clear Windows NT and that back office suite of solutions, and honestly Microsoft Office was going to be the dominant office player.
A good guess.
So I took a leap of faith, quit my job, joined with a colleague of mine, and we created our own essentially Microsoft back office solution provider. Based in the middle of England. We get certified, so I did all the Windows NT certifications and got certified, became a Windows trainer, which looking back is terrifying. I was teaching people how to use computers, but that's fine. And then, because we were a young and ambitious company and we made all sorts of terrible mistakes owning that business, we realized that the real money in technology wasn't in the middle of England, it was in London where the banks are. So we moved the business to London. We became very fortunate to become associated with a large bank, and ultimately they ended up buying our business. And that's how I think I went from pure technology and being a technologician driven about just technology. Once our business was acquired by the bank, my perspective shifted a little bit, because then what we were actually doing was we were providing technology to help the business and not just for technology's sake, and that was a big transition.
Okay.
So I'm a junior manager now, and again incredibly lucky, because had I come into the bank, just being hired, first of all, I don't think I'd have got an interview at the bank, to be perfectly honest. And secondly, I think because of the way that acquisition had worked, I'd ended up in a more senior position than I was really, honestly, qualified to do. What that meant, though, was it gave me a lot of scope to essentially spend time maturing my skill set. And the skill set wasn't technology anymore. It was, how do you apply technology to the problems the bank has to make the business better? And I was also lucky at that point that I was hungry enough that I would literally turn down no opportunity. So when a colleague of mine decided that they, in fact, it was my boss at the time, said, we're going to start something in India, looked around the room and said, will you go to India for a couple of years? And I said, yes, why would I not do that? I mean, this was it was the birth of the Indian outsourcing sort of industry, sponsored by a bank, and I could, live effectively there. So, I went to live in India, became the senior person inside that outsourcing company owned by the bank as we drove solutions back into the bank. And, that's, I think, where you start to really hone your management skills. So, you start to understand that decision making and authority come with the ability to do the management piece as well as the technology. That's kind of where that transition really starts to happen. Now, I've always worked for ambitious people, and with that comes a lot of change. So, I was in India when the CIO who had purchased the business I work for essentially called up and said, I'm leaving the bank and moving to Denver to become CIO for a telco here. I moved back to London, and he called me up and said, I've got a job for you. Do you want to come here? So I left the bank, and again, incredibly fortunate really that the opportunity was open to me, and the fact that I was lucky because the way American telco corporates work and the way banks are compensated, there was a big gap. So it meant that for my boss to hire the right talent into that business meant that you had to get put into a pretty senior position inside a large company. So again, I found myself somewhat accelerated in terms of my position in the company, and I learned a lot there too. And I put this as the at that point I'm maturing. So I'm not a technology person. What I am is I'm now a business person who's interacting with the business, and becoming a mini CIO is essentially what I am. So if as you progress your career, being that business relationship partner inside a large company it's the training ground to become an executive that wants to run a technology organization. Again, lots of change inside telco at the time. So my boss ended up moving back to England, taking another position. And I actually followed a couple of executives out to Seattle to turn around a failed VC-backed company.
That's exciting.
It was exciting, but we didn't turn it around.
No, well, that also happens. I mean, that's just...
It is. What that does give you, that gave me, though, is you come from senior executive inside a larger company to being effectively in charge of the technology organization for a small company. But what that experience led to was an appreciation for where board members and investors interact with a business, which when you're lower in your career, you don't see. When you get more mature, you start to understand what those relationships mean and how they are important. And it was a great time to essentially hone my what I believed were the strategies to make a successful organization, or a successful technology organization. For me, again, you asked at the very beginning, what's the traditional route, and that would be continual growth inside one organization. That stair step that I took has involved being able to be kind of flexible about moving organizations. So from that VC company, which was a small company, it wasn't a large. I mean, this was a smallish team, but the problem with the company was big. I then followed the CIO who I worked with, who sent me to India, to London for a bigger role in a very large telco. But what that meant was, at that point there, I'm now effectively I'm a small CIO, so I own an area of the business, and I say small because the company I work for had about 26,000 people in its technology organization. And of that, my team was about 2,500. So it's a very large team,
it's huge. Yeah.
but I'm still not actually really in charge, right? I mean, I run my area, but the bigger strategic decisions are being made outside. What that gives you, though, is that gives you the ability then to find a business at some scale where you can then really lead, because as frustrating as it is, often there is that people look at how large an organization have you managed as an indication of, are you capable of managing a large organization? So you kind of need to find a path for that. Ultimately, I came back to the States, had a pretty senior position in another telco, which gave me a lot of authority, and we did a lot of M&A kind of activity. But that's the point in my career where I really realized I had a couple of paths. I could stay in that business and figure out how I was going to wait to essentially ascend to the CIO chair, or I would have to take a step out of that business, find a smaller organization, frankly, and become the CTO fully in there. And for my last few roles, I've really fully been the CTO, in that position, and that has come with growth in each of those roles as you kind of go. So I look at the progression there as, while the path may not have been completely traditional, because I don't have a degree, I've been super lucky and been sent on lots of executive training courses and everything else that comes along with it. It's kind of that learning period, there's the maturing, and then the last sort of, I'd say 10 years has really been mastering, and that is applying what you've learned and models that you are taking to organizations and then making that work. So that's kind of that's my journey from working in a mailroom to ultimately, CTO of a public company.
Which is amazing.
I'm a aspirational tinkerer, so I read a lot of content about technology. A lot of the basics are, there's a lot of foundational stuff which hasn't changed over the years in terms of the way technology is really constructed. So I think there's the ability to have a sense of what you're being told is accurate and possible. I think that's honed by a lot of experience and having the experience of doing it yourself to a certain extent. And we'll come on to this in a little bit, but I think there are different styles of leadership as an executive in charge of a technology organization, and I think matching companies that have an appetite for technology oriented CIOs and CTOs with your skill set is really important. It is really important.